Hi guys, my name is Lara Jane, and today we're gonna discuss about economic institution. So what is an economic institution? The term economic institutions refers to two things. Number one, specific agencies or foundation, both government and private, devoted to collecting or studying economic data, or commission with the job supplying a good service that is important for the economy of the country. Number 2, well-established arrangements and structures are part of the culture or society. Example, competitive markets, banking system, kids allowances, customary tariff tipping, and system of property rights are examples of economic institutions. One of the challenges in any society is how to produce, distribute, and consume goods and services. As we, the members of the society, are tasked with organizing ourselves as we convert raw materials from nature into finished products, and how we transform human capital and talent into services that we provide for comfort and convenience. As individuals interacting in a social community, the process of production and distribution, consumption, is manifested in economic institutions, which refer to the processes as we engage with each other as producers and consumers of goods and services. It is therefore important to understand these economic institutions. From a sociological point of view, there are two ways to look at the value and the purpose of economic institution in a society. You can either look at it from functionalist perspective or from the conflict perspective. The functionalist perspective views economic institutions as vital components of society because they are involved in the production, distribution, and purchasing of goods and services that are essential for survival. They could refer to as systems, agencies, or organizations, both in public and private sector. They are involved in production of food, clothing, and other material items that people need and want. So, in general, it is an economic system that provides the institutional arrangement and according mechanism of the different activities that take place in the economy. The conflict perspective, on the other hand, argues that economic institutions merge in order to benefit the ruling class or groups. A major prominent of this perspective is Karl Marx. This perspective asserts that economic institutions are established by the ruling order in order to benefit their group at expenses of ordinary laborers. Specifically, it identifies the capitalist as the one who perpetuates income inequality and deprives proletarians or working class access to decent quality life. While there's some truth to the Marxist perspective that economic institutions provide more benefits to the powerful, there's also need to recognize the necessity of this same economic institution to provide all needs of the members of society, regardless of their class. The large complex societies that we have today heavily dependent on economic institutions to provide guidance and organizations to all economic activities. The economic institutions that we will mention in this lesson are the non-market institutions such as reciprocity, transfer, and redistribution, the market system and its relations with the state, and institutions attending international trade. Non-market institutions. Reciprocity exists when there is an exchange of goods or labor between individuals in a community. This would include direct barter or simultaneous exchange of goods, or gift exchange, where the return of for goods given or labor rendered is delayed. Gift exchange is different from true gift giving, where no return is expected. An example of reciprocity is when neighbors exchange food for labor rendered, or when farmers rotate among their farms to help in cultivating the land. It is understood that no money changes hands in the whole interaction. Transfer, on the other hand, entails a redistribution of income that is not matched by actual exchange of goods and services. An example of this is a donation or financial assistance from a richer relative, or a farm subsidies given to the farmers by the government. Transfer of productive assets due to inheritance could also qualify as transfer payments. Redistribution can be considered as a combination of the features of transfer and reciprocity, where the economic exchange involves the collection of goods from members, the pooling of these goods, and then the redistribution of these goods among the same members. Reciprocity, transfer, and redistribution are all considered as non-market transactions since they do not entail the exchange of cash for rendering of service or provision of goods. Market institutions. A market system is a type of economic system that allows the free flow of goods between among private individuals and firms with very limited participation from the government. More specifically, this type of economic system is characterized by the following key features: private property, freedom of enterprise and choice, self-interest, competitions, market and prices, reliance on technology and capital goods, specialization, and use of money, and an active but limited government. In a market system, private individuals and firms own most of the factors of production like land and capital. In fact, it is a dominant control and access to the capital that gives capitalism, the other term for market system, its name. Private ownership encourages investments, innovation, and efficient use of the factors of production. Individuals and firms are encouraged to build factories, till lands, and create new and better things because they stand to benefit from their own efforts, hard work, and creativity. Private ownership does not just refer to real property, but also to intellectual property, like patents and copyrights as applied to different media like books, music, and television show scripts. Lastly, private ownership encourages the efficient use of the factors of production so as to raise the level of productivity derived from used said sources. Freedom of enterprise and choice allows all economic actors, whenever an entrepreneur, a worker, or a consumer, to pursue activities that will yield the most benefits for as long as the activities are within legal limits. For entrepreneurs, this means the freedom to access and utilize the different economic resources to produce their choice of goods and services and sell them to their target markets. For workers, this means freedom to pursue economic opportunities for which they are qualified. For consumers, this means the freedom to buy goods and services that will give the highest level of satisfaction. Another principle associated with the market system is the invisible hand.
The invisible hand integrates both the idea of self-interest and competition in the marketplace, which brings about a socially optimum result even in the absence of government intervention.
The explanation behind the invisible hand is simple. The desire to maximize gains both by buyers and sellers leads them to the actions that will bring about this goal. For producers, this means the production of variety of goods and services desired by the consumers using methods of production that are cost-effective. For the consumers, this means buying goods and services that will provide the highest level of satisfaction at lowest price available. It is for these reasons that self-interest and competition are integral to the market system because the pursuit of advancing the interests of independent economic actors leads to advance of interest of the whole economy. Markets and prices are the most important features of the market system. A market is a mechanism and not necessarily a place which brings buyers and sellers together for a desired transaction. Prices, on the other hand, serve as a signaling device to indicate the value of a good or service to both buyers and sellers and guide their actions on whenever they should buy or not or supply more or less. Another important characteristic of the market system is the extensive use of capital goods and technology. The market system rewards the technological innovation by bringing more profits to whenever the idea of the new product or production technique came from. Innovators as opposed to imitators, win the market system by being able to produce goods and services that are desired more and produce it in a greater volume than ever before. Just as biodiversity exists in an organic environment, so does variety in goods and services are needed for the diverse needs of the members of society. Specialization is another requirement for a market economy. Critical to a market economy is the ability to produce goods and services efficiently. It is easier to produce goods more efficiently with specialization. Human specialization is called division of labor. Specialization contributes to efficiency by taking advantage of the differences in every person's abilities. If person A is more knowledgeable in carving and person B is better at weaving, it is efficient to use their labor resource to let person A concentrate on carving and let person B concentrate on weaving. Furthermore, specialization saves time by allowing individuals to concentrate all their mental and physical facilities on a single task. It also avoids loss in time, which takes place with shifting from one job to another. The use of money facilitates an easier exchange between transacting parties. Prior to its invention, barter or swapping goods for goods is the traditional means of exchange. Barter is difficult to carry out because of the presence of mutual coincidence of wants or transacting parties finding and having each other's desires. Is hard to come by. Money then becomes very convenient means of standardizing values pegged on goods and services. Lastly, a market system encourages an active but a limited government. A market system promotes efficiency but is not a perfect system. The government is still needed, like when there's a market failure and a monopoly emerges. The government is also needed to carry out interventions to promote the welfare of all segments of the economy, which includes those who may not have access to the factors and productions, like land, capital, and even labor. The market transaction involves parties who sell their goods and services in exchange for cash from consumers. A market economy is where the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services operate through these forms of exchange. These interactions come in a form of purchase at a given price of a good or service. The determination of this price becomes a key task in a market economy, and it is a distinguishing characteristic of this type of market. A free market economy is the one where the price of a good or service is determined by forces of supply, the available level of products or services provided by the producers or sellers, and demand, the level of willingness of consumers to purchase. In perfectly competitive market, where there are many competing sellers and the consumers are well informed of their options of where to buy, the market price is estimated to be the price where supply equals demand. This is the most rational price considering that is price where the willingness of sellers to sell coincides with the willingness of consumers to buy. When the supply is higher than demand, we have a surplus. Thus, rational sellers will decide to adjust their prices to the level of consumers are willing to buy, or else they will be left with unsold goods. On the other hand, when demand is higher than supply, then we have a shortage. In this situation, producers can adjust their prices up to a level that consumers are still willing to buy. Any price higher than that will lead to a point where consumers are no longer willing to purchase, thereby leading to the seller having unsold goods. Thus, in theory, a perfectly competitive and free market is a rational mechanism to allocate goods and services to the competing wants of consumers. Examples of these free markets are the sari-sari stores and the food industry. The market economy subsists on the principle of classical economies, where it is assumed that the invisible hand of the market will lead to self-interest. It is assumed that the invisible hand of the market will lead to self-interested but rational consumers and producers to agree on a price. Classical economic theory asserts that markets should be allowed to operate with minimal interference. Thus, the government intervention should be minimized if not avoided. However, in reality, a perfectly competitive market is constrained by the fact that some industries, due to the level of capital required, ends up involving only a few sellers seller or producer. This is what happens in oligopoly. Examples of oligopolies are the mobile phone service industry as well as the airline industry, where there are only few service providers. In some instances, there's even only one seller, which was happened in monopoly. The power industry is an example of monopoly, where for example, Meralco is the only power service provider in many parts of Manila and its surroundings. The problem with oligopolies and monopolies is that the sellers or service providers could now have a prerogative to dictate prices to the detriment of ordinary consumers.
State-market relationships.
So today guys, we are going to talk about state-market relations. What are state-market relations? State-market relations call for a holistic view of relationship between the material and the rational dynamic of society on the other hand, and between these dynamic institutional dynamics on the other. It is in this aspect that the state plays an important role in the market. The state, through government, comes in to regulate prices to protect the interests of the consuming public. Basic commodities such as food are subject to price selling of maximum price. The prices of electricity and mobile services are subjected to government regulation, and the bodies are established such as the Energy Regulator Board to determine the price of these commodities. Labor is also considered a commodity, except that in this case, the seller of this service are the workers, while the consumers are the factories. Labor is determined as producer good, since it is an input to the production of goods and services. The state, through government, comes in to regulate the price of the service, which technically is in the form of wages the workers earn. Unlike in the case of consumer goods, where the government set a price to control a determine of maximum price beyond which seller will not be allowed to sell. In the case of labor markets, the government's price floors in the form of minimum wages. This is to protect the workers from being paid low wages by their employers. The minimum wage is to determine by regional wage boards, is the level below which no employer would be allowed to pay their workers. Government intervention in economic institution is warranted to protect the interests of consumers and workers. It is also advocated to correct a tendency of the private sector to make decisions that are determined to, which is referred to as the monetary policy. Investment in business could also mean more employment opportunities that can spur consumer spending. On the other hand, governments are encouraged to increase their public spending on infrastructures to further spur economic activity. This is referred to as fiscal policy. The state, as defined by the social thinker Max Weber, is a political body that exercises monopoly of violence or legitimate control over the use of force within its territory. When the government takes over the functions of the market is producing and distributing essential goods and services, this is called the command economy or a socialist economy. In this system, instead of market forces of supply and demand deciding on what produce or how to produce and for whom to produce, a command economy relies on a central government. The term command economy is interchanged with socialist economy because under both systems, the means of producing and distributing goods and services are done collectively or centrally so that there is equitable distribution among the members of the society. The profit motive is also rejected in a socialist system. It is seen as a means of exploiting labor. For example, wages are kept low to increase the profits of the capitalist. Instead of the profit motive, the primary motivation for economic activities in a socialist economy is pursuit to collective goals like higher standard of living all its citizens. This may mean how to produce only goods and services that are considered essential in the body's welfare. Less production of consumers' goods that are considered frivolous, such as clothes, cars, or gaming consoles. Instead, resources may be channeled to important industries like agriculture for food security and steel industry for national defense. Larger income accrue to those whose labor is marked with innovation, creativity, and industry. Inherent ability, acquired education, and inherent properties also give some people advantages over others and make possible for them to receive larger income. Problems arise through when through no fault of their own. People are deprived of adequate income and access to essential goods and services. Some members of society may not be fortunate enough to be born with inherited property and remarkable abilities, and they may have only modest education and training. The evolution of the economics is also liable for rendering some types of employment and means of livelihood obsolete. The innovation of electronic mail renders less need for postal services, and the invention of portable mobile devices means less installation of public pay telephones. For others, it is physical and mental disabilities that prevent them from having gainful employment. Actually, the government plays an important role in correcting the imbalance in the access of goods and services through the process of income redistribution, the primary instrument used by governments to redistribute income is tax. What are taxes? The taxes are compulsory contribution to government coffers, normally levied on the worker's income, business profits, and consumptions of goods and services. In order to raise revenues for government spending, taxes are needed to raise revenues for government, but they are also disincentives for efficiency and hard work. The government must strive to balance a need for equity and incentive for efficiency. Once there are enough revenues, the government can then decide on whether to use it for government purchase or for transfer payment. It is not a payment for goods and services but means of allocating income to achieve social ends. Example of transfer payments are social security benefits, unemployed compensation subsidies, and veterans benefits, housing, food, medication. As is the case for social security benefits, no output is required from retirees and they are just expected to use their monetary assistance to defray the cost of their transfer payments are important in leveling income between groups who can actively generate sources of income and those who cannot. Social security benefits involve a transfer of income between the old and the young. Unemployment benefits involve a transfer of income between the employed and unemployed. Agricultural price support involves a transfer of income between farmers and consumers of the agricultural product. Price support is the minimum legal price of a good and which is typically pitched at a higher level prevailing market price. This is done to ensure grantee support to the workers of agricultural industry.
International trade.
So now we are going to talk about international trade. What is international trade? International trade is the exchange of capital, goods, and services across international borders or territories because there is a need or want of good or services. In most of countries, such trade represents a significant share of gross domestic product or what we call GDP. Economic institutions are not only confined to one specific territory or geographical location. Sovereign nations like individuals and firms stand to gain from international trade by specializing in the production of commodities they can be produced with relative efficiency and by trading with other countries for goods and commodities that they cannot produce as efficiently. There is a need of international trade because the distribution of economic resources is uneven across different nations. Some countries are better endowed with skilled and inexpensive labor, while there are countries that are endowed with expensive lands. Industrial advanced country may be better endowed with capital resources and therefore better equipped in producing capital-intensive goods like automobiles, agricultural equipments, and similar type of machineries. Products are also differentiate as to quality, design, workmanship, and other non-price attributes. Some people may then prefer imported goods to similar goods produced domestically because of these non-price attributes. Just to reiterate, international trade benefits nation because it enables economies to employ its resources in ways that increase its total output. But just like in a market transaction that take place within a nation, there are still arguments put forward against international trade. One major issue against international trade is that it is harms domestic industry and particular groups of resources suppliers who cannot compete with bigger international firms. This calls for some government interference in a free trade. The most commonly used protectionist measures are tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods, while the quotas are the limits set on the quantity of imported goods that can enter domestic economy. These measures protect domestic producers, but they can harm domestic consumers who end up paying higher than world prices for protected goods. Domestic firms that use the important goods are also worse off because they have to pay more for the input to their production. Protectionist measures also reduce competition in the protection of industries. This is not good because it is competition that induces firms to innovate on design and introduces new products as well as improves production and techniques. The imposition of trade barriers by one nation may also result in the retaliation of trade barriers of its own by another nation. The escalating tariffs and quotas will reduce the world's total output and everyone is worse off. This situation is called trade war. Trade war. It is for this reason that economics of the world generally agree that reciprocity is better principle to observe the conducting international trade. Reciprocity is international trade is the granting of mutual concessions among different countries with respect to commercial trade restrictions like tariffs and quotas. This typically means the lowering of the trade barriers in exchange for similar concessions from another country. Reciprocity agreements may be brokered between individual countries or groups of countries. It is traditionally principle under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or what we call GATT, and the World Trade Organization, or what we call WTO. Although it can be traced as far back as the Reciprocal Trade Agreement of Act 1934 in the case of United States. This trade with other countries even without approval of Congress. This eventually led to the creation of GATT in 1947. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act only permitted bilateral negotiations.
Non-state institutions and organizations.
Good morning everyone. Our next lesson for the day is all about non-state institution and organization. The non-state institution are individuals and organizations na nakikipagmain sa international affairs and relations pero hindi sila associated sa anumang state, bansa, or nation. The next thing we will discuss is difference between institution and organization. An organization is a systematic gathering of people who work together for achieving the desired end. Under a common identity, and an organization is governed by rules, regulation, whereas the custom and values are regulating factors of an institution. Ang goal ng mga turong samahan ay maaaring pampolitika, panlipunan, pampinansyal, libangan, edukasyon, kalusugan at iba pa. So, ang institution naman ay nade-describe as a form of organization which is set up for an educational, religious, social, professional cause to deliver knowledge to the people. The next topic we will discuss is the following is considered as a different institution in society. First, environmental worldview is what you think the world works, what you think your role in the world should be, and what you believe is right and wrong environmental behavior. Second, knowledge system. Yun yung namamahala siya kung paano ma-engage ng mga tao yung paglaganap, pagkuha ng resources, lalo na sa technologies na mas easy makakakuha ng resource like product or sources. Third, tenural and property system. Tenure system is regulate how individuals and groups gain access to the land and other natural resources and determine the rights and duties associated with the land use and ownership. Fourth, a conflict management system is a system within an organization for the prevention of escalation of conflicts and handling and resolution of conflicts. Lastly, association system. It's a various system na kung saan makikita ang manner ng bawat isa na bubuo ng relation sa kanila para ma-maintain yung interest nila sa isa't isa tulad ng product and social security. Binubuo ng norms, bayanihan, at conduct. Next topic we're gonna tackle is the following are state organization. First, exclusive branch. The president and vice president, sila yung mga nagkicarry out or yung mga taong isinasagawa ang batas. Pangalawa, legislative branch. Senate, Congress, and House of Representatives, sila yung mga gumagawa ng batas natin. Pangatlo, judiciary. Supreme Court, sila yung mga nagkusoy or nag-evaluate sa mga batas natin. Pang-apat, armed force or police. Sila yung mga responsible sa pag-support sa kapangyarihan ng bansa at sila yung mga nagkatanggol sa teritoryo laban sa lahat ng mga kalaban. Pang-lima, Constitutional Commission. Civil Service Commission, the Commission of Election, and the Commission of Audit. Sila yung mga nagpo-promote sa pag-unawa at awareness tungkol sa saligang batas at halaga nito. Last, local governments. Halimbawa nito is munisipyo, barangay, sila yung mga responsible sa pagkatid ng complete service na requires sa mga individual na pamayanan.
Market and economic organizations. What is market and economic organizations? Include the cooperate environmental users, such as corporations use the resource for profit and not for substances. Cooperatives and trade unions are also considered as market or economic organizations. A bank is a financial institution that lends money both to public as well as private organizations. We have a different types of banks. Savings banks. These banks are suited for employees with a monthly salary. Commercial banks. These banks collect money for people in various sectors and gives the same as a loan to businessmen and make profit and interest these businessmen pay. Industrial development banks. These banks are committed toward enhancing the growth of industries by providing loans for a very long period of time. Land development banks. These banks promote growth in food sectors by giving loans to farmers and relatively lower interest rate. Indigenous banks. These banks, they collect money from the community and provide loans to businessmen and industrialists for a short amount of time. Mortgage banks. These banks specialize in providing mortgage loan alone. Spare banks. They promote both savings and commercial facility to both people and organizations in Norway. Federal or national banks. These banks control the principles and policies of other banks across the country. Consumers banks. These are consumer-friendly banks. They encourage the consumer in buying commercial products
and provide opinions for easy repay of the loan amount. Community development banks. These banks provide services to the community where there has been nothing or very little development over the years. Credit unions. They act just like a cooperative bank, expect they provide services to only one employee union in the community. Postal savings banks. These banks are oriented with postal services. Private banks. These banks are not for the general public or community. Offshore banks. They are also private banks except that they have little tax to pay for their transactions. Ethical banks. As the name implies, ethical banks promote candid transactions between various consumers of the banks. Internet banks provides banking facilities only via internet. Investment banks. These banks are for large organizations' investment ventures across the industry. Merchant banks. They promote investing in organizations that huge benefit for a long period of time, rather than brand new organizations. Universal banks. These banks have a wide spectrum of financial assistance. Islamic banks. These banks are based on the principles of the religion Islam. What is cooperative or corp? A cooperative or co-op refers to an autonomous association whose membership is voluntary toward the attainment of common economic, social, and culture need or aspiration. We have the different types of cooperative. Housing cooperative. A housing cooperative is where represents either own shares reflecting their equality in the cooperative's real estates or have memberships and occupancy rights in a not-for-profit cooperative, and they underwrite their housing through paying subscription or rent. Worker cooperative. A worker cooperative or producer cooperative is owned and democratically controlled by its worker owners. Consumers cooperative. This is a business owned by its consumers. Agriculture cooperative. Agriculture cooperatives are widespread in rural areas. Punta naman tayo sa civil society organizations, academic and science-based organizations. These include universities, schools, and colleges, which use statistical method in conducting opinions, polls to guide advocacy and decision-making. Mass media. It is primary means of communication used to reach the vast majority of the general public. The most common platform for mass media are newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and internet. Religious organizations. They promote and regulate relations between human beings They are typically aimed to promote worship, prayer, meditation, teaching, healing, and spiritual well-being. Non-government organization or NGO. NGO is a non-profit group that functions independently of any government. NGOs, sometimes called civil societies, are organized on community, national, and international levels to serve a social or political goal, such as humanitarian causes or the environment. Last one is people's organization. People's organization are grassroots-based organizations composed of people who are really in the community and are directly involved. Civil society organizations or CSO are non-state actors whose aims are neither to generate profits nor to seek governing power. Civil society organizations unite people to advise, share goals, and interests. Private sector. This is a term describes any private-owned group or person involved in profitable activities to part of the national economy that is not under direct government control. Research institutions. Defined as any group involved in investigative study for scientific or educational purpose. Bilateral organizations. Bilateral means two-sided and refers to organizations that operate directly between two well-defined parties, typically two countries. A bilateral agency may restrict interactions to only two countries. Multilateral organizations. These organizations form between three or more nations to work on issues that related to all of the countries in organization.
So today we are going to talk about the international development and global processes. So what do we mean by international development? International development is a broad concept denoting the idea that societies and countries have differing levels of development on an international scale. Other related concepts are, for instance, competitiveness, quality of life, or subjective well-being. Many development issues have become international in scope in that they involve the participation of many countries. The Philippines, just like any other country, is confronted with many serious problems, most of which have diverse causes and even more diverse consequences. These problems together threaten the security of society and its people. International development and global process. Poverty threatens the security of our economy. Ang kahirapan ay tuturing na isa sa mga pinakamalaking banta sa seguridad habang binabawasan nito ang kalidad at dami ng buhay ng mga maralita at mayaman na nagbubunga ng equality. Second, conflict among group. Ang hindi pagkakasunod-sunod ng mga grupo sa isang lipunan ay isa rin sa mga problema na kinakaharap ng bansa na nagbabanta sa seguridad ng ating lipunan at mga mamamayan. Third, agricultural problems. Ang pangunahing problema na kinakaharap ng bansa ay nakapaloob sa agrikultura ay loss of agricultural land. Because more land is lost, mas magiging difficult sa pag-produce ng pagkain na kakailanganin sa pag-grow ng human population. Fourth, continuing pressure on the environment. Ang pangunahing problema na kinakaharap ng bansa ay nakapaloob sa agrikultura ay ang air and water pollution na nag-increase and extinction of plants and animals continues to rise. Ang global organization ay ini-impluwensya nila yung mga bawat bansa. Ang World Bank ay isang international na bank na nagpo-provides ng assistance financially sa mga developing countries para sa mga development programs, at ang goal nila ay pababain ang bilang ng kahirapan o poverty. Ang International Monetary Fund promotes global economy growth and financial stability, encourage international trade, and reduce poverty. Ang Asian Development is a regional bank.
Development agencies and transnational advocacy groups. Development challenges are increasingly found in conflict-affected and fragile states. As stable low-income countries have managed to achieve development process, issues such as climate change, food security, and financial stability are also becoming priorities across an ever-widening group of developing countries. Addressing these monumental challenges requires action beyond aid and the capabilities of most traditional development agencies. Hence, these agencies outline course of actions faithful to the paradigm of the future. It states that as development agencies grapple with their future direction, they must think about how they can, number 1, demonstrate leadership in managing the international system, including the reform of international agencies. Number 2, respond effectively to the development needs of fragile and conflict-affected states. Number 3, increase capacity to provide a development perspective on global challenges such as climate change, poverty, gender, conflict, and financial crisis. Number 4, engage much more effectively across different ministries and develop a whole government approaches. Here, some of the well-known development agencies in the Philippines are the following. Number 1, United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Number 2, Australian Agencies for International Development, AUSSIAID. Number 3, Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA. Number 4, Dutch Glitch for International Zumischblet, or GIS. Number 5, Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA. In addition to bilateral and multilateral organizations, there are also private foundations that are independent from government, though most of them are based in one particular country. An example of this is Ford Foundation. Funding agencies exert enormous amount of influence on policy making by funding programs and projects within a certain policy conditionalities. In the Philippines, foreign donors fund a big proportion of environmental management programs. In fact, the Community Forestry Program was implemented mainly through foreign-assisted projects. The imposition of policy conditionality can be both restrictive and enabling. It can be restricted in a sense that local initiatives and strategies are forced to adapt to the imposition by the donor. On the other hand, the propagation of participatory approaches and the mainstreaming of gender equality are enhanced by policy conditionalities imposed by certain donors. Then, we have the mediators for international research and development. These organizations provide funds and support to policy and researches, the results of which can become inputs of global advocacy. The Consultative Group in International Agricultural Research, or CGIRA or CGIAR system hosts many of these organizations. These organizations provide support that help applied research find its way to policy. The Philippines hosts one of the CGIAR organizations that is focused on rice research and development, the International Rice Research Institute, or IRRI, in Los Baños, Laguna. Also included in this second group are the various UN-based organizations such as the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, and international NGOs such as the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF. The major difference between the funders and the mediators is the fact that the latter does not exercise influence on the policy through imposed conditionalities. Instead, they do it through the work of epistemic communities. Sometimes, epistemic communities are organizationally integrated to the establishment of units tasked to mediate science and policy within the global region or regional tasked to mediate science and policy within global or regional institutions or organizations. An example of this is the ASEAN Regional Center of Biodiversity Conservation or ARCBC and the ASEAN Regional Center for Agriculture or CRSCA, which are both based on Los Baños. Finally, we have an international development advocates that are very much involved in social advocacy for the environment, educational, and human rights issues. Examples of these are Greenpeace, Human Rights, and Transparency International. These organizations are the forefront of the social activism in many countries, including the Philippines. Transparency International focuses advocacy on good governance and transparency and serves as an anti-corporation watchdog. Human Rights Watch is very active in human rights and peace issues, especially in areas of the country which peace and order problems like Mindanao. Greenpeace is the forefront of the anti-GMO campaign in the country.